I'm Haley B. Miller, and this is Ohio Politics Explained, a podcast where you give us 15 minutes and we give you all the news you need to sound smart and impress your friends. Welcome to a special episode of Ohio Politics Explained. Ohio is a big deal for the upcoming election, but it has nothing to do with the presidential race. Voters in the Buckeye State could very well decide which party controls the U.S. Senate come January. Senator Sherrod Brown is seeking a fourth term against Republican businessman Bernie Moreno, and it's Brown's hardest race yet. The political winds are against him. Ohio is a lot redder than it used to be, and Donald Trump won the state in 2016 and 2020. But Brown is a unique politician. If any Democrat can defy the odds, it may be him. To dissect the race and what's at stake, I brought in Jessica Taylor, the Senate and Governor's editor for Cook Political Report. Could you, set the scene for us a little bit in terms of what the Senate map looks like nationally and what's at stake in terms of who may be in control come January?
Yeah, so Democrats started off this cycle with an incredibly difficult Senate map. They're defending 23 seats to just 11 for Republicans, and 8 of those are in either swing states or in overwhelmingly red states. And, we started out with West Virginia being the most difficult state. I think that even if Joe Manchin had run for re-election, that would have been a very uphill race. With him not running, that seat goes to a solid Republican. So, and all of a certain flip. So functionally, essentially the Senate map then starts out at 50-50, meaning that Democrats cannot lose any incumbents further beyond the West Virginia seat, and they still have to have now Vice President Harris win the presidency to make sure that there is a Democratic vice president breaking the tie. So there is no room for error.
And that's why a lot of the attention has come down to Ohio and Montana, right? Because those are the two incumbents left that are in Trump states.
Right, yes. They're very, solidly Trump states. I think that last week, we moved the Montana race from toss-up to lean Republican. I do think Montana is the most vulnerable seat for Democrats. That is a state that Trump won by 16 points, and I think that Jon Tester has certainly outrun the top of the ticket before. He did in 2012, and he has in midterm years, but we see the top of the ticket so closely aligned with Senate races. In 2016, every single Senate race went the same way as the presidential race. In 2020, only Susan Collins of Maine managed to win re-election, even as Biden won her state. She outran the top of the ticket by 7 points. That's the same number that Jon Tester outran the top of the ticket by in 2012, but Romney won that state by 13 points, a much closer margin than 16. And I think Trump's on track to win that state by at least 16, possibly 20 or more. And that just becomes more difficult. His approval ratings are underwater in that state. And, we've consistently seen polling with Tim Sheehy opening up a small but notable lead. And, then I think Ohio by the numbers is easier. It's a state that Trump has won twice by 8 points. So in Ohio, it is a smaller lift for Sherrod Brown to outrun the top of the ticket. And what we have seen is that, in Ohio, there's more Republicans to consolidate. We do see Brown in polling still getting a notable amount of Republicans and winning independents. And I was talking with people, with sources about these two races, because fundamentally, when I think of them together since they're the two red states.
Right.
And I think the key difference has been that in Montana, along with attacking Tester and trying to bring down his approvals ratings and favorability ratings, Tim Sheehy has been running positive ads about who he is as a veteran, emphasizing his family, his kids that were born in Montana, talking about who he is. One strategist that was watching both races said, they're giving him a reason to vote for him. I think Bernie Moreno hasn't done that yet in Ohio.
Mm-hmm.
He's emphasizing that he's the Trump-backed candidate. And in a state where Trump is going to win, that could be enough. But I do think that could be a key difference of why this Montana race is, for Republicans, they sort of refer to it as slightly ahead of schedule in that regard, versus Ohio, you still see in the polls Brown leading slightly. It's very close and it's within the margin of error, but he is consistently leading, where Moreno is trailing behind Trump's numbers in the state.
And Ohio is still a toss-up for Cook at this point,
It is still
right?
a toss-up, yes.
Something I've been wondering, because we've heard a lot about Senator Brown's crossover appeal, and we've seen that bear out in past elections, his other re-election bids, but he's never been on the ballot with Trump before, and I'm curious if you think that makes a difference for him this time.
I mean, I think it's harder. We have seen that Trump has an ability to bring out voters that don't traditionally vote in these presidential elections. I think that's why we've seen it harder to poll some of these places in 2016 and in 2020, why some of the polling was off. But then again, I do think that Brown also has an ability to bring out voters too. And I think in a presidential year, there will be, in 2022, I think the Democrats saw there were a lot of, voters in the urban areas in Cleveland, Columbus, and Cincinnati, that there were still a lot of Democratic voters that were left on the table. I think in a presidential year, you do get higher turnout, and that could be fixed in a way. But you're right. I mean, I think this is very different than in 2012 when Obama won the state. So.
Can you talk a little bit about the money piece of this? I mean, there's just so much of it coming into Ohio, and, I don't think money goes as far in Ohio as it does in Montana.
Yeah.
But, I mean, it's pretty overwhelming. Like, we're not a competitive presidential state, but I feel like we're seeing presidential campaign level ads almost.
No, I do not envy anyone who is in Ohio and that has to see those back to back. Yeah, I mean, it really has become sort of a mini presidential race in that regard, and I think neither side's going to want for money, but you do see a lot of outside groups pouring this money in to help Moreno. You have the crypto group that has now come in to help him, and then you have Democratic super PACs that are helping Brown on top of Brown's already impressive fundraising, which means that his dollars can go further than outside money can and different things. But, is there a point where it's saturation? I think, what we're seeing, this crypto group pour so much money, and they are telling a little bit about Moreno, and that could be building his profile a little bit. But I mean, I do still hear from Republicans sort of a frustration that, his allies will point out, well, he had a competitive primary. These other candidates like Tim Sheehy, other places didn't. But that was in March. It was the earliest primary. And I do hear a frustration that he should have been up with positive ads or sort of telling his story over the summer and different things, that they sort of let Brown set the tone. A lot of them compare it to the 2022 race that, they felt like Vance sort of got a later start. But that was an open seat race. Running against Sherrod Brown is very, very different. But, it's just can they bring those Republicans back? In 2018, I looked at the exit polls. Brown got 11% of Republicans and won independents by 12 points. We haven't seen a ton of polling out there yet. A July poll had Brown getting, I think, 14% of Republicans. So, and, that was against a very weak opponent in 2018, and that was a very favorable Democratic year, too. If Moreno can get his name out there, emphasize that he's a Trump candidate, that might be enough. But, but this race is by no means over. I think that Sherrod Brown's still very much in this.
Yeah. Speaking of 2022, I'm curious if you see any parallels between Sherrod Brown's campaign and Tim Ryan's. I think some Democrats and, people on the internet, which you can say whether the internet's real life, of course, but I think a lot of people looked at his decision not to go to the DNC in August, and it kind of raised some eyebrows, especially because at that point we were looking at Vice President Kamala Harris as the nominee and not President Joe Biden.
In a state that's that Republican, I guess I wasn't that surprised. We saw John Tester not go, and we also saw Jackie Rosen in Nevada, and that's a much more competitive state, not go as well. I guess I just fundamentally look at him and Tim Ryan as different. Like, were they sort of trying to speak to the same voter, that populist blue-collar voter? They were. But I think Sherrod Brown just had a longer history in the state of doing it, and he's an incumbent. And also, he is an incumbent, so he's automatically, I think, going to get more money. I know one of the frustrations of Tim Ryan's campaign was that they didn't get the outside money and things, too. But fundamentally, you have to be an incumbent protection program. They have to protect this seat. That was a challenger race, even though it was an open seat race. But last cycle, Democrats needed to protect incumbents in Arizona and in Georgia. So, I think that the calculations are a little bit different. And in the same way that I think, sort of the brand that Trump has built doesn't necessarily translate to other candidates. I think in the same way, I think the brand that Sherrod Brown has built doesn't automatically, transfer to other candidates as well. I think he's just a very unique political figure within Ohio.
Yeah, which I think, begs the question as to whether Moreno is going to be able to kind of ride Trump's coattails in Ohio, or if at some point he needs to establish his own brand and kind of tell that story.
Yeah, and I think, again, if Moreno is not able to pull that off, I think there will be a lot of people looking back and pointing to that was a fundamental misstep. If he does win, then he's won, but there could be some Monday morning quarterbacking going on if he does not win.
Yeah. So I think we just alluded to it a little bit, but for each of the candidates, what does the recipe to success look like for these final however many weeks we're at?
I think for Moreno, it's just emphasizing I'm the Republican. You want a Republican Senate. If you're going to elect Donald Trump, you need to give him a Republican Senate, and just emphasizing party and trying to consolidate the party behind you. Because there's no question that Donald Trump is going to win the state if he can get those Trump voters that, are overwhelmingly, he can afford to lose some, but, cannot afford to lose, 8 points or even maybe 6 points or something, behind Trump and different things. And I think for Brown, it's just emphasizing that he's a different type of Democrat, that you know me, you've known me for, 18 years in the Senate in Ohio. Before that, you trust me, and you don't know this other guy. You don't trust him. He's just out for himself. He's this sort of shady car dealer. You're going to see them emphasize, and different things. And I think that goes back to, because they have attacks against Moreno's record. Has he done enough to answer that, I think, is a question as well. But Sherrod Brown's biggest hindrance is that, Harris is going to lose the state and that he has a D beside his name.
Yeah. Ohio Politics Explained is brought to you by the USA Today Network Ohio Bureau. You can check us out on X, formerly known as Twitter, @Ohio Explained.